Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the film Ex-Husbands. I'm joined today by writer and director Noah Pritzker, along with actor and executive producer Griffin Dunne, and cast members James Norton and Miles Heizer. And starting off with you, Noah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that you conceptualize this film, because I've heard you discussing the fact that it came from your own experience of your parents splitting up and looking at the idea of, in turn, what if there were other relationships going through changes? And I was interested in how that created this real cross section of, life points that all three of your main characters are at, and how you kind of took that initial inspiration into this family drama.
Yeah, I think at the time, I would joke that I wasn't a child of divorce. I was a man of divorce, since my parents were divorcing when I was a grown up, and kind of uh, thinking about the absurdity and of having all of these feelings that felt sort of childish, to be so upset that my parents were separating, even though I lived 3,000 miles away, and didn't really impact the day to day of my life. And then I extrapolated that out, and for whatever reason, what emerged was Griffin's character of Peter kind of stumbling around his father is getting divorced, and Griffin in the character plays Peter, a man of divorce himself, who's then left by his wife, and this character who I think really defined himself as a father to his young sons, and a husband to Maria Pierce, and a son to Simon and Eunice, and can no longer claim any of those things. They all get taken from him, and trying to kind of figure out his new identity as as a man in his later 60s. Not to date you.
Yeah, you just outed me.
I mean, Griffin, to everything that Noah was just describing, and the fact that you're playing this character that's going through this real sense of, what is my identity? Because everything that he's tied himself up in identifying as is suddenly pulled from underneath him. I was interested in kind of how you found the starting point of putting this character together, because it's about who was he before that, and who is he trying to figure out who he might be in the future moving forward.
Yeah, well, that's what I really enjoyed about this character, that it dealt with things I was very familiar with. I have outlived my parents, like the person I play, and had been divorced. And I'm the father to grown-up children, and or one child. And and it sort of deals with, I kind of had my past to work from, just in terms of experience, and knowing that just because your kid graduates from college and gets a job and goes out in the world, that doesn't mean they're not going to have issues that you're going to deal with, or that they're going to see issues that you're going through. And this is a great sort of three generational story of manhood and masculinity in this day and age, and just dealing with very contemporary issues. It's a rare thing.
Yeah, it's so great. And, James, in talking about your character, he growing up was, always ascribed as he's a genius, and he was advanced a couple of years in school at a young age. And yet he's at a place where he feels incredibly stagnant and completely stuck. And I was interested in how much you looked at the childhood self and just the pressure of all of these expectations, and kind of how that had led to where we meet him in the film.
Yeah, we did. There was a lot of conversation around that in regards to Nick, and I think Noah was, open about certain people in his past that he knew, and we were able to discuss others. And it's a very recognizable trait that, it's a mistake that I think a lot of parents make, and it's maybe not necessarily even a mistake, but it's just, a brilliant child has to be handled with delicacy, I think. And Nick clearly was a brilliant child, and I think there's a line even where Griffin's character says, he felt like he was, what the line is, but he was always right, and it was almost kind of, if you get the sense from the father that he was almost intimidated by this intelligence, and it's a question how you then deal with that as a parent. And Nick was unfortunately one of those kids who came out of all that pressure and expectation, and was never able to fulfill it, and so his life is almost cursed because he was always going to disappoint. There wasn't, when you start life on that kind of trajectory, it's rare that you're able to fulfill those expectations. And so, yeah, we find a man in his mid to late 30s, who's sort of hollowed out by that experience, and has this kind of wearing down, this attritional kind of disappointment that he's constantly bringing about people who love him. Um, Ironically, I think those people, they just have to be around, and they're surrounded by people who love them unconditionally. But for them, I think maybe their love and the love that they receive from other people is predicated on how they're succeeding and what they're achieving, and then he clearly isn't achieving very much, and so we find him at this very low ebb. And it was really, for me, it was interesting to play someone who was dealing with grief, and Noah, in the way that Noah writes and directs, is incredibly tasteful and contained, and as a result we were able to explore someone who is dealing with incredible loss of hope and dreams and all the expectations, and in this relationship, and that grief was dealt with a really light touch. We didn't have these big demonstrative, we had one big demonstrative scene which then he didn't use in the edit, but generally it was a man who had sort of been hollowed out and didn't have any grief to hang on to. It was a man empty rather than full of suffering, which is a really interesting kind of journey to take.
Yeah, definitely. And Miles, in talking about your character, one of the things that really struck me about him is how much he's trying to put everybody else first. And he's kind of the middleman who's balancing the feelings of his brother and everything that his dad's going through, maybe sometimes being a little bit neglectful of himself. And I was interested in how looking at the way that he really props up and kind of puts these relationships first and foremost shaped some of the aspects of this character for you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like with Mickey, he's very much caught in the middle of these two people who both are sort of not helpable ultimately, but put in this precarious position of trying to balance everyone's feelings and keep everyone at bay while also dealing with his own issues and trauma sounds like a very dramatic word, but dealing with his own stuff and trying not to bring that to everyone else. And I think it makes for a very interesting sort of story, especially for a gay person who's like already has this, at least to me, I think a lot of queer people, we already have this thing that we're dealing with, but not really bringing to anyone's attention because we feel like people don't understand it. So to combine all of that into one, I think it makes Mickey very interesting. And I think it's a very, very fun part for me to play and something that I definitely relate to in my own family.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing all of that. Noah and Griffin, in talking about your collaboration together, I know that Griffin, you signed on to this project very early, and it took a little while for the film to come together. There were a few delays with COVID coming into factor. And I've heard Noah talk about how Griffin was really instrumental as you were going through rewriting the script during that time as well. And so I just wanted to ask both of you how you feel like it gave the story and this character a lot of time to really develop. And, almost sometimes there's a little bit of a gift in the extra time you get in trying to get a film together.
Yeah, I mean, in a funny way, although I never would have wished for this because you just want to go make the movie, it became sort of like a few years of development and rehearsal and kind of shaping this part around Griffin. I think he's such an infectious personality, and it's hard. You can't get his voice out of your head once it's in there. And so I think then kind of going back to the script, knowing it would be Griffin and rewriting it, it felt very organic. It wasn't like it needed an overhaul for Griffin, but it was sort of fun to just look back to, revisit the script with Griffin in my head, and we would chat and talk about our own life experiences and movies we loved and books we were reading, and so I think a lot more of Griffin kind of crept into the project.
True story. Yeah, it's and we have very similar sensibility. We saw the same cast. Noah had the idea for Rosanna Arquette. I had Richard Benjamin. I mean, both of them were just home runs. And when we were shooting, we both saw the same movie and the same character in Peter, and was made sure, as my main concern would be not to slip into being a one-tonal sad sack throughout. He's got his depressions and all that kind of stuff, but also, to keep it aloft and never settle on just one thing. And anytime you can get a laugh out of depression, I would go for it.
Was that something that all three of you found as actors that, with Noah's writing in the script and the way that he was directing you really lent into the emotion of these journeys that they're each going through, but also allowed you that space to kind of find these little nuggets of comedy because it's almost this like quiet undercurrent of amusement at times?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like Noah and I, and all of us, to be honest, have very similar senses of humor and sensibilities. And I think the thing that's so wonderful about the movie and the script is that it deals with these sort of heavy topics, but in a way that is a little light because, as Griffin said, I'm like, we got to make a joke about depression. There's nothing else to do about it. And I feel like the movie does a really good job of that and allowed us a lot of fun to just, I don't know, make things that might not have seemed funny, sort of funny. And obviously they did that after the fact in the edit. Like I see all these things and I think the movie's hilarious, even though it's obviously about very serious topics.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's difficult to talk about you because you're here, but he's very, very courageous as a director and as a writer.
Memorial.
We'd have scenes which were beautifully written and maybe a little bit more like buttony, on the nose humor. There would be like a gag here or whatever, and it would be cut. I mean, the stuff was changed and improved and sacrificed along the way. And we saw the movie again last night, and it really struck me again how there were many moments in the film that Noah, as a writer and a director, had the opportunity to sort of lay down a gag. At the end, where we're sitting on the bench and there's the hand in the box, and Peter explains that, yeah, it's Popper's hand, and the three of us just sit there, and then Mickey says, "God, that's a bit gruesome." There's a gag there, but he plays it completely authentically, and it's as you say, it's kind of it's a gentle humor. It's very observational. It's real. It's authentic. It's not. It's not scripted, and as a result, you never feel Noah's kind of self-conscious voice pushing through, which is a very generous and courageous thing to do as a writer. Often you have people who write and direct, like they want to be like, "This is my line. I'm a great writer," and Noah's very light touch really puts us forward and allows us to be on a very authentic, truthful journey. It's rare and a lovely thing.
I mean, I love the description of a light touch, Noah, even in terms of when it comes to the conflict and the antagonistic elements within the story, because it's not something where you have these three characters all at odds with each other. They're three people in a family who really love each other and have a lot of care and affection. Maybe they don't have the perfect relationship and they're still kind of trying to recalibrate themselves a little bit. And I was interested in how you almost found it was like the external forces that were the conflict around them more than within each other.
Yeah, I think I remember while writing this script was sort of it occurred to me that there was something interesting about just that these characters really loved each other and wanted to do right by each other, and the obstacles are still so clear. It's not like it's easy for them to be there and to support each other. They're really struggling to figure out how to do that. I think James's character Nick so desperately wants Peter to rise to the occasion and be his father, but Peter's going through his own turmoil. Peter, I think, so wants to be a good father to Mickey and understand his life and his hookup, and yet kind of needs to be the baby because his heart's been broken. And Miles is kind of the baby of this family who's also stuck taking care of everybody. And I think while I was writing it, I was interested in that idea of these characters trying to figure out how to be there for each other and love each other and support each other, and it's still feeling almost impossible.
Yeah, Griffin, there was a moment with your character where he says something along the lines of, "I'm not going to spend the rest of my days in a rocking chair." And, there's this real juxtaposition of looking at his father's ailing health and then thinking about what he wants and kind of propelling himself outside of his comfort zone. We see him on this trip striking up conversations with strangers and throwing himself into new experiences. And I was interested in how that idea of looking at a parent, who's towards the end of their life, unfortunately, also kind of gave your character a little bit more of like a zest for life and a want to move forward.
Yeah, well, it definitely had that effect on my character, and as you age, and then your parents pass on, and they're in their natural state. It does bring what life you have left more vivid. It makes it your moments more vivid, and in this case, it's the great thing we would talk about all the time was, does Peter know that there was the bachelor party, his son's bachelor party when he goes there? And it can go either way, but it definitely is an attempt to really throw himself into life, be a little reckless. There's a wonderful just side moment with actors that were only working in one scene, where I just go off and talk about taking acid and getting on the stage, and in my earlier years, and it's just a side. It comes out of nowhere to see this element of my character in his past, which I found very kind of illuminating. And why does that occur to him now? He's in Mexico and going through a divorce, and his son is having issues, and so it's like all those those little moments are what makes a really interesting movie.
Yeah, it does. And James, I'm mentioning possible spoilers for what I wanted to ask you about, because there's a scene early on where we see your character interacting with his fiance, and when you watch the film back, it plays very differently, because you actually realize this isn't a conversation about them, having the movers come because they're moving somewhere. It's because they've broken up and she's moving out. And I thought it was really sweet to see the fact that even within that, they still say "I love you" to each other at the end. And just wanted to ask your perspective on your character's space within that breakup, and the fact that for both of them, it's not because they don't care about each other. It's just the circumstances of life kind of got in between them a little bit.
Yeah, that struck me as well in the script, and actually, it's also the case with Peter and Rosanna Arquette's character. That they also say to each other, "I love you" at the end of the phone call when Papa Simon has passed away, and so it's a kind of family and a film full of love, and it's testament to the fact that love doesn't just disappear. And Rachel, who plays my fiance or ex-fiance, she's just brought such warmth to that role, and it's not that many scenes, but we really felt like there was a depth there. That letter as well is incredibly touching. The mark of a true love story is if you end it as a sort of improved and an individual who's grown and been nourished by that experience, irrespective of how much pain there was when the experience comes to an end. And I think, it's just a very sweet portrayal or kind of version of what it is to be in a relationship, and a mature one that we grow, we are nourished by these people. They come and they go, as Griffin said. People pass on, relationships end, and I think it's funny, as I've had relationships end as well, and it's a really important philosophy to take with you, that through that grief, which feels kind of completely all-consuming, Rachel's character has that moment of real wise words, which is that you've got so much to be grateful for if you end a relationship and you've moved on, and that part of that growth is the person you're with. So again, wise old Noah just has a
And, Miles, you were talking a little bit about some of this before, but I was interested in kind of where you found your character, because he's come out fairly recently. He talks at one point in the film about how as a kid, he always knew that he was gay, but he hasn't come out until adulthood because he kind of wanted to try to prove people wrong. But we also know that he hasn't come out to his coworkers yet. So it's still kind of a little bit of a journey for him day by day with people in his life. And I was interested in how that shaped aspects of who he was, and kind of where you found that self of sense and self of identity, because he probably has different versions of himself that he's still presenting to the world depending on where he is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of my favorite things about the character is getting to explore a father-gay-son relationship where it's not centered around the father struggling to come to terms with his gay son. It's more about seeing how a supportive family can sort of help their gay child through that process. And yeah, I think it's very common for gay people. I think it's very relatable. You sort of start slowly coming out, and it doesn't mean that you're not comfortable with yourself. It's just sort of this weird adjustment period where you're like, I guess I'm gonna tell them this thing, even though it doesn't really change anything. And I think that, I think that makes for a very interesting gay character. And obviously it sort of enmeshes into the whole situation with Arroyo and telling Nick or not telling Nick. And yeah, I think that it was very fun for me to get to do that and explore sort of even just a parental relationship on screen that isn't centered around the child being gay and it being a complete disaster for everyone involved. So yeah, I had a very good time doing that.
That's great. Noah, one of the things that I loved about the directing in this is the way that you've kind of framed and shot Tulum as a location, because yes, they've escaped from their day-to-day life and they're on vacation and there's this lovely aspect to it, but there's also this realism in the way that you've shot it. And I know that even just the massive amounts of seaweed on the beaches, which are, from climate change, wasn't something that you were expecting when you got to the location, but kind of found that it really fit in with the characters. And even just when you were thinking about your shot list, how did the idea of wanting to have a realism to a location like Tulum really shape the film for you visually?
Yeah, at first it was sort of horrifying when I got there and saw how bad the seaweed sargasm was for a few reasons. One, I had these guys who I knew were excited to come to a beach location, and I don't think Griffin had been there since Tulum was like a kind of secluded hippie destination. And I knew he was coming into like a club, now a club party zone covered in seaweed. So that was sort of, I knew I was going to have to brace for that. But I felt for the movie it was always sort of like the more complicated Tulum became, and the less dreamy of a destination, the better. In some ways, it was for the movie that these guys were heading to what was supposed to be a paradise, but isn't actually a paradise, and is in some ways a nightmare for Nick, to be in a place like Tulum. So I think that really worked in our favor, and we just embraced it that it was there and added a really unique texture, I think, to the film that we had the seaweed. I mean, sad for Tulum and the Caribbean, and that that's happening, but it was sort of an interesting thing to get to be there to capture.
Mhm. No, definitely. And I wanted to ask all of you a little bit about just the way in which you've told this story and kind of shaped these characters' journeys, because they all go through a little bit of change. But, I think James was using the word, contained to describe it. And the majority of what they're going through takes place over just the course of a few days. And, it's really sweet to kind of see their relationship change and, kind of who they become at the end. But it's not like any of them become completely different people. It is this kind of contained incremental journey. And so I wanted to ask all four of you about how that really shaped a lot of the film and the narrative that you were creating together.
Well, we shot it like all movies, out of sequence. And when you read a script, you picture an arc, and where you are at the beginning and where you are at the end, and all the stuff in between. But when you're shooting it, you kind of forget about all that stuff. I mean, it's not like you go back, or at least for me, I don't go back to the notes and go, "Oh, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be feeling." You should be familiar with the story enough to really just show up, and all you really have to do is sort of listen and be in the scene, and the rest takes care of itself, hopefully with a good editor, and certainly a good director who sees the structure of a performance. And looking at the movie, it looks like you did just that, when you put it together.
We were we were lucky as well, which is another rare thing with this movie, is that we all went out to Mexico City early, and we had about a week, if not more, of rehearsal, and we actually got to sit in a room and talk at length about our characters and the family that we come from, and that's stupidly not often the case, and this is a small movie as well, and again, credit to Alexandra, the producer, and Noah and everyone who kind of put this together, because they gave us that time, which then paid dividends, I think, later on, because as Griffin said, when we then got to the scenes, however out of order it was, we sort of knew where we were and we were anchored. And again, it's also Noah's just brilliant calibration, because he's a kind of conductor, tonally, it never, as you say, it never betrays itself, and everything is so subtle. For me, Nick,
sorry.
I was gonna say the tiniest changes are so deftly handled. The poem which he prints off and kind of folds quite hastily into his pocket and then goes off to meet his father and his brother. And there's a certain ever so slight urgency which we haven't seen in Nick before, and it's because he's finally doing a gesture for someone else. And it's just whatever's happened over in Tulum and whatever journey he's about to go on after the film ends, you can just sense that there's a change there. And it's done so deftly and elegantly, but it speaks volumes. And again, God, I really am being a complete sycophant today with Noah, but
I'll take it, wherever I can get it. No, but those few days to read through the script is such a gift to me too, to hear dialogue by the actors who are playing the characters read it out loud. And it's very obvious when you're sitting around a table when somebody says something that doesn't feel right or isn't a good line, and so to have those few days to read through it and to be comfortable enough with each other as a group to kind of say that line, I don't buy it, or as kind of, not just for me as the writer to try and defend everything on the page, but to feel it out together was a gift to this project that we had that.
And we got to spend loads of time in Mexico City. We had this
Mexico City
job we've ever been on. We had like a month in Mexico City, then we were in Tulum. We had a week in Holbox because the turtles were migrating on the beach we were meant to shoot at. So the conservation, you can't come and shoot here. So we had this extra week where we all just went on holiday and had a jolly, which definitely also helped the kind of dynamic of the family because we basically would just sort of fall in love with each other.
It's true. It's one of the few things I've done where I'm like, I'm not fully remembering filming the movie. Yeah. It felt like we were just sort of on vacation, and then you see it and oh yeah, we like made an entire movie while we were there. I don't even remember that.
All the photographs at the end during the credits, they're just holiday snaps. They're nothing to do with the movie. They're just us on a jolly having the best time of our lives.
And no, I feel like the kind of calibration that you find throughout the film also really allows for that payoff when you have a scene later in the movie where everybody gets into this combustible argument in the middle of a cemetery because it feels earned at that point. And again, I think it also goes back to the comedic element that you're talking about, because there is something inherently funny about watching that happen and very real about the fact that grief brings out these sorts of emotions. And how did you feel like what you'd built the rest of the film really allowed all of those different aspects of a scene like that to come together?
That was, I think the arc with Griffin's father came later. I think I had a lot of the stuff with Peter and his boys in the middle of the movie. And I think then realizing that it would be sort of perfect if this movie began with Peter learning that his father was leaving his mother. And then I followed that through of Peter kind of, it's sort of like the catharsis of his grief of everything he's losing. And there's something, and I think Griffin is so excellent in this way of like, it's so, you feel for him, and yet you totally understand why he wants to be taken care of, but he's also the father, but he's being so needy, but he is burying his own father, but he wants to be taken care of, but he's spilling the beans and revealing secrets. And it's one of my favorite, all these guys are so great in that scene, and Miles is, finally defends himself and yells at everyone. And it's so funny to see Griffin finally cornered and called out on his shit. And he knows that he's busted, but he's kind of hanging on to his last shred of pride or dignity. And I think, I was lucky to have such, all of these guys have such great comic timing. And I think are such good team players and kind of know how to set each other up, which makes my job a lot easier.
And Griffin, did you find that there were aspects of playing this character where you almost found him, a fully fledged adult, but kind of still stuck in his childhood self a little bit because of circumstances? There's something to be said for the fact that 6 years after his parents separated and his mom still passed, and he still wants his dad to like put the wedding ring back on, and, kind of still wants to be the one taking care of a little bit, because I think no matter how old we all get in life, there's always that part of you that regresses around certain family situations.
Yeah, I based it entirely on Noah's father. It did have that, and it was relatable to all the flaws and we're all just. I always look at us as, no matter what our age, we're still works in progress, and we'll be striving, but there's no end, to our disastrous choices or triumphs, and relationships. Nothing really is stagnant in life. So I was just sort of following what was sort of on the page and in the room when we were shooting it.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I really appreciate all of you sharing this about the film. Congratulations on the movie, and thank you so much.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.